Great. So, hi, I'm Dr. Heather Sandison. I recently published a book that hit the New York Times. We're really excited to share that. It's called Reversing Alzheimer's. And what I share in there is basically what I've learned over the past 6 or 7 years through my work at Solsari, which is our clinical medicine practice, outpatient practice, as well as what I've learned through Marama, the residential care facility for the elderly that I set up here in Southern California. We now partner with senior living facilities across the US, where we are creating an immersive experience in Dr. Dale Bredesen's work so that people can get the most benefit from it. Often these changes that we're suggesting people make when it comes to their brain health are very challenging. They're lifestyle based. And I'm going to get into a lot of those in what I'll share today. But that's hard for people even with full cognitive capacity to do, let alone somebody who's struggling with cognitive decline. And so what we've tried to do is set up as much support as people need. And many people don't want to move into senior living. Many people don't want to move their partner, their loved one across the country to do this program. And so we also have coaching for them. And we've learned so much. It's such a privilege for me to work with the pioneers in this space, the patients who are willing to do the work that it takes to optimize their neurological function. And so I'm really excited to jump into just how we do that, the nuts and bolts of how we're getting this done. And I'm going to focus a lot on the clinical side, even though we do the coaching and the residential experience. I know that, here talking to practitioners, I want to make sure that you feel like you can take this and confidently apply this in your own practice, because I think functional medicine, naturopathic providers are really the best trained providers to meet this tsunami of people, this older demographic that has really ballooned in the US with the baby boomers approaching the 65 and over there. Today, 10,000 Americans turn 65 each day, and there are over 6.7 million Americans diagnosed with Alzheimer's and 11 million Americans providing unpaid care in the US today. So this is a massive issue as you talk to people, as someone who is focusing on dementia and Alzheimer's. The more people that know about my work, the first thing they say is, oh, my mom, my aunt, my grandma, this person that I know and love has been through this torturous process. And I want to know how to prevent it for myself, prevent it for my mom who's starting to show signs. There's a lot of cost associated. So if we can come in and reduce the cost, and of course, most importantly, reduce the suffering, we're winning. So just to get started, I want you to imagine your own retirement. So fast forward, whether you are at the beginning of your career, the end of your career, just close your eyes for a minute and think through, what do you see yourself doing in that last chapter of life? Most of us we think of ourselves like fishing up north, right? And or maybe sitting on a beach somewhere tropical and reading a book and having a cocktail and our feet in the sand with our loved ones. And other people think of being a grandparent and picking out these incredible, age-appropriate, totally wonderful gifts and watching your grandchildren open them. And yet, unfortunately, the reality for so many people is that they end up in a rocking chair, in a recliner, checked out, unable to hear, unable to see, unable to engage, not remembering the names of loved ones, not recognizing loved ones, unable to drive, unable to potentially get to the bathroom on their own, and losing their dignity and their sense of self, right? Our memories are that sense of self, our ability to connect and engage. I have the privilege of working with elderly folks and asking them, what are the things that are most important to you? What are you most proud of? What are your happiest memories as you look back on life? And 9 out of 10 times, it's not money, it's not accomplishments, it's connection, it's relationship. And so that is the magic that we have to share when we apply this approach. So the objectives as we go through this today are, one, to go through the current research, to really understand what is the research telling us about, is this possible? I'm saying reversing Alzheimer's. That's the cover of my book. That's the name of my book. And it's bold. And 10 years ago when I was in training, 12 years ago when I was in training, it's going by fast, I was told there was nothing you could do for Alzheimer's and dementia. And to suggest that we could help people was to create false hope and to do harm. And yet now what we see is that to suggest there's nothing you can do to optimize brain health at any stage is to create false hopelessness. And it's really our responsibility to stay up with the research, to understand what's going on, and to make sure that our patients know that there is not only something you can do, there's an overwhelming amount that we can do to optimize cognitive function. So we'll go through the current research, the common causes, how we'll work that up, the labs that we'll do, treatments to consider, and how to track changes. And of course, I'm not going to get to all of this in lots of depth in the next 45 minutes, but I am going to cover as much as possible and hope that at the end of this, you feel confident that you can say to a patient, if you are struggling with cognitive decline, there is so much we can do. And if I can't do it for you, I can connect you with someone who can. So why am I so certain that Alzheimer's is reversible? One, because I've seen it. Two, because I've measured it and we've published it. And the most exciting story about that is that I am not the only one, that other providers are measuring this, publishing it as well. So I came to this as a skeptic. Dr. Bredesen, I heard him talk in 2016, 2017 at a mental health conference, IMMH, and he was describing people reversing their Alzheimer's disease, people reversing their cognitive decline associated with Alzheimer's. And I was very skeptical. I had heard and I believed the well-meaning, well-intentioned, well-educated people who had said that that wasn't possible. And so I took it with a grain of salt, but I was very interested because one, the pride in me was like, oh, if I could treat Alzheimer's, then I can treat anything, right? Like, okay, then that would be a good doctor. And also, with autoimmune disease, I don't know if other providers feel this, but I'm like, I didn't have autoimmune disease. So I can't I'm not the Isabella Wentz. I'm not the person who's gone through this and can tell you my hero's journey, but nobody wants a doctor who's had Alzheimer's, right? So it's like, okay, I can do this. And then also, the way Dr. Bredesen presented it, it conceptually made so much sense. He was saying basically take all of naturopathic medicine, all of functional medicine, and apply it to the health of neurons. Take this complex system science approach. So I was trained by him in 2017, and I came back to my practice and I was on the list of providers trained by Dr. Dale Bredesen. I was the only one in San Diego. So patients were showing up at my office. This was when his New York Times bestselling book, The End of Alzheimer's, was published, and there was a lot of momentum and interest around this. So people showed up with way more confidence than I had, thank God, because Arlene came with her husband one day, and she had a MoCA score of 2. So the MoCA is the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. This is a blunt instrument, but very easy to administer in a clinical practice. It doesn't have to be a doctor or nurse that does it. It can be a medical assistant. You just take the training online, mocatesting.com, and it's a PDF. It's free. Takes about 15, 20 minutes. And then you get a score out of 30. 30 is perfect. 26 and above is normal. And as you go towards 0, this is a way to indicate that we are getting much, much further down the path, a more progressed disease state. And Arlene came in with a MoCA score of 2. Clinically, this looked like complete dependence on her husband. She could answer questions with yes or no, but she wasn't having a conversation. I would ask her, our typical naturopathic questions. What did you have for dinner last night? Do you have a bowel movement every day? And I could see the wheels turning in her brain. But by the time she could make sense of the question and put an answer together, she'd forgotten the question. And her handwriting was really cramped. It was at an angle. It was illegible. And of course, this was affecting her quality of life. Again, she was completely dependent on her husband. So I sent her and her husband on their way. I went through the motions of everything that Dr. Bredesen had taught me, everything I'd been taught in naturopathic school. We got her on detox supplements. I referred her to a biological dentist. She got her amalgams out. She got on bioidentical hormone replacement. I suggested they move from a moldy bedroom they moved actually into their living room. So they got out of that really moldy space in their house. They started ballroom dancing 3 times a week. They got on a ketogenic diet. She started doing strength training. They did more walking. They really transformed how they were living. And 6 weeks later, she came back and her MoCA score was a 7. She had dramatically improved. And in this moment, I thought to myself, what did we do wrong? This isn't supposed to be possible. I didn't think this would happen. And then once my brain processed and her husband assured me, no, she is different, this is happening, then it was like, how could I do anything else with my life but let everyone know that this is possible? And what about all of that suffering that could be reduced, eliminated, delayed at the very least? And for her, there was so much suffering, and her husband, so much suffering that was alleviated by her being able to say, I'm hot, I'm cold, I'm hungry, I'm tired, right? Just being able to say how you feel and have some dignity back, have some agency back, is a massive difference in quality of life. So The research, this comes out of Dr. Bredeson's work, and I want to just put it into context what this image does. This is change in MoCA scores or other scales on a 30-point. So the SLUMS, the St. Louis test, the mini mental status exam, and then the MoCA scores are 30-point worksheets. And what we typically expect with no treatment is a 2 to 3 point drop in that over 12 months. And what we see with the antibody therapies that have come out is that you do not get an improvement in cognition. So you don't get an increase in MoCA scores. What you get is a slowing of the decline by anywhere from 10 to 30%, depending on which medication we're talking about and whether or not you're male, female, and your genetic status. So we also, just this last week, there was a scathing article in the New York Times, and new analysis of the data around these medications of when they didn't tell people who are at high risk for the brain bleeding and swelling that happens as a side effect. They didn't tell people that they were at high risk. So people with ApoE4 positive status who are most likely to get dementia are the people at highest risk of brain bleeding and swelling when it comes to using these medications. And then the other thing that they analyzed was death rates. And it looks like using these medications increases your risk of death by 3 to 4-fold. So high risk, high cost, and they do not improve cognition. And so this is part of why I think naturopathic medicine, functional medicine, this RECODE program is Dr. Bredeson's program. And when we measure MoCA scores, there's an average of 3 to 4 points in improvement in cognitive function over 12 months. So this is wildly different from the medications that are out there. We are actually seeing improvements. And in some cases, this is an average. So in some cases, it's actually even much higher. So this was published in July of 2022 in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease. The lead author on that paper is Dr. Kat Toops. And what they did was they took 25 participants through a 9-month intervention, and the MoCA scores, in those 25 participants, the MoCA scores went down to 19. And so they saw that 84% of those participants improved their cognition in that 9 months. So the next year, I published a paper that was 23 participants instead of 25. We took participants with MoCA scores. In order to be eligible, they had to have more cognitive impairment than the Bredesen-Toops project. So they had MoCA scores between 12 and 23. So this was more progressed cognitive impairment. And we took them through a 6-month intervention. So it was a shorter intervention. And what we saw, as you might expect, we saw that 74% of our participants improved. And we saw statistically significant increases across the means of all participants in MoCA scores, in overall cognitive function, in memory specifically, in quality of life, and in sleep scores. So this was really exciting. Again, we published this in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease. It was in August of 2023. And I was surprised to see that the results were this good. Most of the time, people are getting better. And so this is the application of naturopathic and functional medicine for cognitive function, and it works. Just this past June, this was published by Dr. Ornish, Dean Ornish, at the University of San Francisco, UCSF, University of California at San Francisco. You might have heard of him because he does a lot of cardiovascular research. He published the first randomized control trial. He took 49 participants, a control arm and an intervention arm, through a lifestyle intervention for dementia. And he said that this is from the conclusions. I cried when I read this in June. Comprehensive lifestyle changes may significantly improve cognition and function after 20 weeks in many patients with mild cognitive impairment or early dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. This should be front page news, and it was in Time. Sanjay Gupta did a CNN docu-series on some of these patients, Rudy Tanzi and Dean Ornish's patients. And this is really the first intervention that shows improvement in cognition in comparison to control. So why is it that we've gotten this so wrong? There's a whole book called How Not to Study a Disease, The Story of Alzheimer's, by a gentleman named Carl Harub, and it talks through the politics, the money, the marketing, everything that has gone into really steering us off the scientific method, steering us away from really finding the solutions that are helpful. And part of it is because the paradigm is in this, it's set up for pharmaceutical interventions, right? A single molecule intervention with randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials being at the penultimate, right, at the top of the hierarchy in how we think about research. And we cannot blind or these protocols. You know when you're doing meditation and you're in a support group and you're changing your diet and you're getting more exercise and your sleep is improving. You just can't blind that. And you can't, we have trouble even controlling for it, because as people learn about this, if they're not in the intervention group, they start reading the books and changing things up and taking the supplements. So really, it's about a paradigm shift, right? If we want to find a solution that matches the complexity of this disease process, we need to think through a complex system science lens. So if you have a plant in your house and you are trying to keep it alive, make sure it looks like this. I've killed air plants. So really, this is probably not the best analogy for me personally to be using. But if you want your plants to look like this and they start looking more like this guy, you don't go to this plant and think like, oh, you must have misfolded proteins. How do we get these misfolded proteins out? Right? You think, is this plant getting enough light? Is it getting enough water? Is it getting too much? Does it need nutrients, right? You think about it as a complex system, and you think about the inputs and the outputs and what it needs to thrive. And we haven't done that with the brain. I mean, this is obvious, right? This is common sense, just uncommon practice. So I would even argue that the cause of all disease is imbalance. And what do I mean by that? Once I was talking to Deepak Chopra and I said balance, and he was like, balance doesn't even mean anything. I was like, no, it does. I have a definition for you, Deepak. It is too much, too little, in the wrong place, or at the wrong time. It's imbalance. And our goal is balance. The right amounts in the right place at the right time for a complex homeodynamic system. Right. So an example of too much is going to be too much blood sugar, too much sugar that's going to cause insulin resistance. This becomes toxic, and that is going to drive the neurodegeneration associated with Alzheimer's. Too little glutathione, too little B12, methylated B12 is going to increase our homocysteine, which is associated with quicker brain atrophy. The wrong place. If we've got mercury or beta amyloid accumulating in the brain, not going through the lymphatic system because we're not getting enough sleep at night, we're going to have too much of a good thing. Amyloid is antimicrobial. It's there to protect us, not give us dementia. And so if we have that building up in the wrong place because other things are out of balance, we're gonna create imbalance in the system at the wrong time. If we have melatonin increasing in the morning and cortisol increasing before bed, we're not going to have the right amounts at the right time of the signals that help us to maintain that homeodynamic balance. So where do we apply this to? The causes of all chronic disease, I would argue, and Alzheimer's disease in particular, are finite. We can list them, and I'm happy to have conversations about maybe we should increase this list, but I would argue that most everything fits into these 6 categories. So number 1 is toxins, and we're going to go through case studies of each of these, and I'll show you some of the testing that I use to identify these, to find them in patients, and then treat them. So toxins come in metals, biotoxins, or mold toxins, and chemical flavors. I think of them like ice cream. And then nutrients, they come in macro and micro, right? We can think of our macro, our fats, sugar, carbohydrates, and our proteins, but also all of our micronutrients, right? I mentioned methyl B12 and all the methyl donors that are vitamins, our minerals. How we get those nutrients balanced at both a macro and micro level is important. Structure, again, has macro and micro levels. Our bones, our joints, our nerves, our airway, sleep apnea is a major contributor to cognitive decline as we age. Blood vessels, our plumbing, right? If that plumbing isn't open, if we cannot get oxygen to the brain, we cannot get nutrients to the brain, we're going to have imbalances. Traumatic brain injuries, getting hit over the head with a baseball bat increases our risk for developing inflammation that then can lead to dementia over time. So thinking through these systematically, talking to patients about them is important. And then on the micro level, it's our molecular structure, our genetics. Are we at risk genetically? Now, we can't change that. That's not a modifiable risk factor, but it's one that we can be aware of so that then we can put more effort into mitigating the modifiable risk factors. That is going to be the bulk of our conversation. And then stressors. There's lifestyle factors, right? And stress, again, it's a balance thing. Thinking back to that balance beam, it's you want enough motivation, right? You want meaning and purpose and engagement, but we don't want so much stress that we're decompensating, that cortisol can be directly toxic to the hippocampus. The amygdala and the hippocampus, the emotional center and the memory center of the brain they are right next door to each other. You can't separate them. And they also are dramatically intertwined. So much of our emotional response to things impacts how we remember it. And this is why torture doesn't work. When we're under a lot of stress, our brains stop working, we go blank, right? But also if we haven't gotten good sleep. Now, on the flip side of that, right, we want purpose and meaning, and we also want that hormetic effect. When we stress the system in some ways, like fasting, when we do hot and cold therapies, cold plunges and saunas are part of this. When we do oxygen therapy, even like hyperbaric chambers, where we're changing oxygen, where we have contrast in the pressure of oxygen, or we use contrast oxygen while exercising. Exercise itself, right, is this hormetic response where we're stressing the system so that we get more resilience, which could be, that adaptive response is a definition of health in many ways. How adaptive are we? How much stress resilience do we have? Now, if you're already under a ton of stress, we don't want to do much of that. And we never want to do that with sleep, but you can see how there's this balance, this dynamic balance of how much stress is in the system. And then infections, dental and gum disease, herpes simplex viruses, COVID, and Lyme spirochetes. There are a handful of infections. And if you go into PubMed and basically look up any infectious agent, any of the microbes, and dementia, you'll probably find a link. There's probably somebody who studied it and shown that link. Because as I mentioned, beta amyloid is antimicrobial, as is phosphorylated tau. So these misfolded proteins are being upregulated in an effort to protect the brain. And so we want to make sure that we don't make them protect the brain, that we keep the infectious burden down. And then when it comes to signaling, this is hormones and peptides and stem cells and all that good stuff. But as we age, signaling changes. So let's jump into toxic exposure. So in the context of dementia, accumulation of toxins in the brain, it leads to inflammation, it leads to oxidative stress, it leads to misfolded proteins, and ultimately to neuronal cell death, right? It doesn't take a rocket surgeon, right? To put to connect these dots. Like toxins in this, that any cell exposed to toxins is going to eventually decompensate. So how do I look at them? I tend to do toxin workup. This is urinary mycotoxins. This was a case where he had a significant amount of gliotoxin, aflatoxin, and ochratoxin. This is the same patient. He also had some lead and some antimony. His arsenic and mercury wasn't terrible, but it was present. And then this was one of his high levels of bromopropane. And then glyphosate was also very, very high. This gentleman was very sick. He had a stroke. He was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. His MoCA score was at 15 when we met. And so he was living in a moldy environment. His daughter was coming from the Midwest to come help and support him and help him take care of his house. He had some tenants. And so she was uprooting her life to come help him. And while he was under our care, he totally transformed. So we opened all of his emunctories. We got him having bowel movements every day. We got him on some binders, and his ochratoxins dropped, his aflatoxin dropped, his gliotoxins dropped. His glyphosate went from 5.7 to under 1, which is where we want it. So we used binders, we used glutathione, we used glycine for the glyphosate, got him on an organic diet, identified that there was mold in his home, and helped and supported him in getting that remediated. And by the time his daughter showed up 6 months later, he was now helping her to take care of her kids. The roles had reversed, where he was going to be a dependent on her. And by the time she showed up 6 months later, he was able to go back into that father, grandfather role and help to take care of them and really support them. It was an amazing transformation to watch. And his MoCA score went up to 21 from 15 or 16. So nutrient imbalances. Again, macro, micro, I ask patients, what their 24-hour recall diet recall is, if they have sweet or salty cravings, are they having desserts or snacks? Are they getting water? Are they being exposed to glyphosate, but also atrazine and other chemicals, pesticides, herbicides that end up in our food? Too much gluten, dairy, the inflammatory foods, processed foods. Are they having a bowel movement every day? Is their GI tract working? Do they have reflux? Do they have bloating? Is there any indication that they aren't actually able to digest and absorb the foods that they are choosing to eat? And then I also am a fan of using continuous glucose monitors. I've got one on right now. Ketone meters. We'll look at multiple times a day to see if people are getting into ketosis. That's something that I highly recommend for cognitive function. And I'm checking hemoglobin A1C, triglycerides are highly linked to blood sugar every 12 weeks. And we see changes within about 72 hours in cognition. So when people get metabolically into ketosis, they often will describe like the lights came on, they have more energy, they're sleeping better, and they start remembering their grandchildren's names again. They start feeling like they can take on life and do more complex tasks like that are required for taking care of themselves, like cooking and cleaning and getting bills paid and things like that. I do watch for antihypertensives and diabetes medications, of course, as we make these interventions. We often will need to adjust those medications. Sometimes people will be on too much of an antihypertensive or too much, particularly insulin. We have to be really careful they don't have low blood sugar. But working with the doctor, that's usually easy. For nutrients, I also I do a stool test, but also will do the micronutrient workup and the CDSA, again, the comprehensive diagnostic stool analysis. Really what we're trying to look for there is digestion and absorption, but also infections and potential colonization. The gut-brain connection, oh my goodness, like I have such a reverence. I don't know that we will ever fully understand it, but it is certainly linked. I mean, with our metabolism, with our mood, of course, the neurotransmitters that are produced in the gut, and having a balance in our microbiome is crucial to cognitive function. Richard came into my office and he came in with his daughter. He was living with his daughter. They were living in Utah. They drove to California to see us, and he had a ton of grandkids, and he literally could not remember their names. He also couldn't remember the names of the farm animals. They lived in a rural environment, and they would drive by farms, and he couldn't figure out that a cow was a cow and a horse was a horse and a dog was a dog and a barn was a barn. He would be calling them the wrong name or unable to come up with the words. And literally, as soon as he was in metabolic ketosis, 72 hours after they got on the program, he remembered the grandkids' names and remembered the names of the farm animals. Now, sadly, one of his sons came into town with his basketball team of boys. And what they would do together was they would always go get ice cream and pizza. And so this pushed Richard out of ketosis, and he stopped remembering the names of farm animals, stopped remembering which grandkid was which. And that was a wake-up call for that family. The sister who he lived with was very on board with all of this, but the brother was very skeptical. And once they watched this happen in real time, everybody was in. His incontinence also resolved. So he had urinary and bowel incontinence that went away when he was in ketosis and came back when he fell out. That's relatively common. Not every time, but it is one of the motivators because nobody wants to be incontinent. I put this in here because I'll just read it. The ketogenic diet has been shown to have a multifaceted effect on the prevention and treatment of cardiovascular disease. This is one of the questions that comes up regularly of but I have high lipids. I have cardiovascular risk. I shouldn't get into ketosis. My cardiologist said no. But among other aspects, it has beneficial effect on the lipid profile, even compared to other diets. It shows strong anti-inflammatory and cardioprotective potential. And part of this is because the heart is resource hungry. Just like the brain, the heart requires a lot of fuel, and the ketones provide a rescue fuel to the heart. And it's also, there's a beneficial effect on the function of the vascular endothelium, which is glucotoxicity, that glycation end products, those can have a detrimental effect on the vasculature. But it's also beneficial for blood pressure and other cardiovascular risk factors, particularly triglycerides and weight loss and blood sugar control. So this is an abstract from a paper where I was like, this sounds like a marketing, this sounds like an ad for the ketogenic diet. I'm not sure if I fully can embrace this. And I looked and I didn't see any conflict of interest, but take it with a grain of salt, but I do want to reassure people that the ketogenic diet can be very beneficial for reducing cardiovascular risk, particularly if someone is overweight, has that high blood sugar, and has high blood pressure and high triglycerides. We see that this is beneficial across the board, particularly if the ketogenic diet they're consuming is not a bacon and cheese diet, but a high polyphenol, fiber-rich, vegetable-forward, with organic, grass-fed animal protein. So it has more of those omegas. You can do a very, very healthy version of keto. You can also do a very unhealthy version of keto. And I hope that all the providers here know the difference. But I just also wanted to reassure, it does not mean that it's bad for your heart just to increase fats in the diet. It actually can be very good and beneficial. Okay, so structure. With structure, there's a bunch of different things that we could talk through here. Vascular dementia. So this is like stroke and ischemic disease or hemorrhagic disease, right? Like this is the pipes. This is the plumbing. If you cannot get blood to the brain, it doesn't work. It leads to infarcts and vascular dementia and ischemia. And then cardiovascular disease, right? Like there's peripheral arterial disease, heart failure. If we can't get the thumper thumping, if we're not pumping blood to where it needs to go, everything's going to fall apart. Now, the one that I really want to focus on is obstructive sleep apnea. And the reason why is because I really think that we could reduce the global burden of dementia by aggressively treating and looking for sleep apnea in all of our patients with cognitive decline. So Priscilla came into my office with her son, and she was living independently. She should not have been. Her MoCA score was an 8, and she lived right down the street from her son. And she's Filipino. Her husband had been in the military, and they met when he was living in the Philippines. And her son had grown up eating the Filipino food that she cooked for him, and she couldn't cook anymore. And so there was, this so much of what happens with the long goodbye that is Alzheimer's is this grief happens day in and day out. It's like that moment you realize that mom can't cook Thanksgiving dinner anymore, right? Like now our family dynamic has changed. The moment that you realize mom can't cook that soup that she used to make you when you were sick and a kid. And he was having a lot of grief around that. Now he wasn't stuck on it. He wanted to just take care of his mom. But what was amazing was when she got back the ability to cook. So he came into my office 10 months after the first time I'd seen her. I kind of forgot about them because they came in, she had a MoCA score of 8. And I was like, I don't know if I can help them. She's not living with him. He doesn't have a lot of control. He's still working during the day. How much of this are they going to be able to do? She never got into ketosis, but the night before they came back into my office 10 months after starting on some of the protocol, he said he had tears in his eyes because his mom had gone to the fridge, gotten a carrot out, found the carrot peeler, peeled the carrot, cut the carrot up, put it into the saute she was doing, and then put the carrot peeler into the dishwasher. And this sort of sequence of like planning, this executive function of finding what you're looking for, going through the motions of doing what you want to intend to do with it, and then wrapping it up and cleaning it up. It wasn't like she can do it without thinking, but she was able to do it again, right? She was able to get back the ability to cook for herself and cook for him. And this was really transformative. And her MoCA score went up to a 13. Her neurologist didn't believe it. They could not believe it. But that's what happens when we apply this. And the biggest thing that we applied was, so she went in, these are ways that we can work up structure. This is a MRI of the brain. Is there vascular disease or is there infarct? And then she was diagnosed with severe obstructive sleep apnea and severe desaturations. And then this is the molecular structure, that ApoE4 that she also had. So when we add these things together, glycotoxicity and genetic risk and sleep apnea, we get an increased risk of dementia. And that's what she had going on. So she got on a CPAP and her MoCA score increased from an 8 to a 13 in 10 months. And she never got into ketosis, right? She was eating a carrot. She was having things with high blood sugar. She was still eating rice, but just treating her sleep apnea, getting her on some supplements, doing relatively minimal intervention outside of the sleep study and then aggressive treatment, she improved dramatically. And I think that we could reduce the overall burden of dementia by aggressively identifying and treating sleep apnea. Now, she was a relatively thin woman. She went in to ask for the sleep study, and the doctor told her, literally said out loud, "You don't have sleep apnea. I can tell by looking at you." 2 days later, this was the diagnosis: severe obstructive sleep apnea. And just treating it aggressively, it's a chore. Going in for a sleep study, you don't always have to do that anymore. We use WatchPat, which is a watch plus a ring that then beams the information up magically to a sleep doctor somewhere, and then they can get you the interpretation and get it. This is covered by Medicare. And so we refer to them very quickly and aggressively for anybody with any cognitive decline, because we've heard so often that thin women who nobody thinks will have sleep apnea, they come back looking like this, right? So this is like my mission in life. Everybody gets sleep studies for your patients with cognitive decline. Stress. Stress, you can have too much, too little. We talked a bit about the hormetic effect, the fasting, the exercise, temperature, even oxygen, but never sleep. And when with my patients, I ask them, what are your stress management practices? Is there prayer, meditation, mindfulness? What are your relationships like, your family of origin? Do you find your work life meaningful and fulfilling? Or is there volunteering? What are you doing in your retirement? What about your finances? That's a common source of stress, particularly as people age, because they're on a fixed income. Do you feel at home where you live? Some people are planning to move into senior living, or some people really don't want to move into senior living. Some people are planning to renovate their house and they still have to go through that process, and that they find that very stressful. So there's all kinds of ways to help with that, but just identifying it and acknowledging it, that if it can play a role for patients, can help to give them the permission they need to start doing something about it. And the way that I test for this is usually with cortisol. We do salivary or urine, I think it's all salivary actually, salivary cortisol. We look at least 4 points. And this patient was flatlined, right? She was no longer making cortisol. So Chris came, she was in our clinical trial. She came to me with a MoCA score of 22. So this is mild cognitive impairment. She was still working in the OR as a nurse. Now, she'd been there for over 30 years. And this was in 2021 when all the nurses were leaving. Nobody wanted to work because of COVID. And she didn't want to leave her team there. She was also forced to take call once a week at night. And so her sleep had been affected for 30 plus years. She was having trouble keeping up with the medical records. She'd have to stay late to finish her charts. When things would change in the EHR, she wouldn't remember how to do it. And she was really struggling and ready to quit, even though she didn't want to leave her team. She also had, her son was getting married and he had some chronic illness, and they were preparing for that wedding and she was worried about him. And she joined the study, and what we did was I wrote a letter to her employer and said, please let her not take night call. And they responded. It was very kind of them. She was off the hook on night call. And then her husband was incredibly supportive. They did everything. They got on the hormone replacement. They got into ketosis. They started exercising more. He went for long walks on the beach with her, and her cortisol curve dramatically changed, and her cognition went up to normal. So she became a 28 out of 30, which is in that normal range. And she was able to keep her job for as long as she wanted to. She enjoyed the wedding. She even looked better because she had lost a little weight and put on some muscle. She felt healthier and she felt younger than she had in years. So that was a really fun case. And stress was, I think, really one of the primary things that made an impact there. So infections, when we have a high infectious burden, which I tend to cast a wide net and say, okay, what all's here? We're looking for, on this test, there's P. gingivalis is one of the ones, but you can see that this patient, this pattern is a significant infectious burden. There's candida in the gut, there's potentially blastocystis, a parasite, there's lots of mold popping up, other gut microbes, and then we've got viruses and the Lyme co-infections. And so looking at this, just asking the question, like, what is the infectious burden? And then specifically asking patients about, do they get cold sores? human herpes virus. HSV1 is associated, it's been found in the plaques in amyloid plaques on autopsy of people with dementia, as have Lyme spirochetes, as has P. gingivalis, Porphyria gingivalis, which is associated with gingivitis. So just counseling on optimal hygiene, optimal oral hygiene, including brushing, flossing, water picking, oil pulling, seeing the dentist regularly, and then referring to a biological dentist if P. gingivalis is popping up, if LPPLA2 is another marker that we can check in the blood to see if that is abnormal, and then getting people the support they need. With HSV1, I'm a naturopath. I use lots of herbs, lysine, even a little lithium salt, Melissa. There's combination products that can help with that, lysine alone for prevention. And then I will use antiviral prophylaxis for those who have cognitive impairment and have a positive HSV1 and you're getting recurrent outbreaks. There's some Taiwanese epidemiological research that showed that people who aggressively treat herpes simplex viruses are less likely to develop Alzheimer's as they age. So that's important to do and something that I treat aggressively. And then Lyme and Lyme co-infections, if you don't feel comfortable treating that, refer out. That is something that there's neurosyphilis, neurolyme, spirochetes infect the brain and can create cognitive decline. And so it's something to be aware of and to treat, particularly in kind of the atypical Alzheimer's where maybe they're not that old or it came on very suddenly or it's associated with something. If you think that that might be contributing, it's important to address that. So Bonnie came in and she's German. She she was young, had a couple kids still in high school, ApoE44, and a very big infectious burden. She had traveled all around the world. She surfed, and she had been to Indonesia and to Latin America. And I mean, she'd just been everywhere, anywhere and everywhere with her kids to surf. And she didn't care to surf anymore. She used to be one of these people that got up early, paddled out, had a great time, enjoyed that with her kids. And she was wrecked. She was so exhausted. She had no motivation. She wasn't finding joy in life. And her cognition, she was terrified. Her dad was back in Germany in a memory care center, kind of like nearing his death, his demise. And she was just like, oh my God, this is happening so early. She was in her late 50s, early 60s, young kids, and just panicked. And sure enough, we were able to find the smoking guns. We got that immune burden down. We got her into ketosis. We found that there was mold in her house, found a bunch of things that were affecting her cognition. And 6 months in, she was surfing again and she was enjoying it and able to do it with kids. And they ended up going to Hawaii together. I was like, you're not allowed to go anywhere where you're going to pick up more bugs, but there's clean food and water there. So it was so satisfying to see her, the fear and the panic resolve a little bit as she was able to get a hold of her cognitive function and enjoy her life, enjoy her kids a bit more again. So the last one I want to go through is signaling. And it's an exciting time in the dementia world, as we've seen, with the research I shared, showing that there are things that we can do for cognitive function. When it comes to hormone replacement and menopause and kind of this, as we're entering sort of like a golden age in all of this, because we went through the Women's Health Initiative, and I think that was really like one of the just biggest mistakes of conventional medicine to suggest that women would be harmed by bioidentical hormone replacement. There's a generation of women that miss the opportunity to protect their bones, their brain, their heart, to prevent cancer, and to have more sex and to have more connection as they age. There was a recent article in Menopause. It was in May of 2024, 11 million women on Medicare, so over the age of 65. And they compared 1 million women who were treated with hormone replacement to 9.5 million that were not. And they saw a reduction in the risk of death, a reduction in all-cause mortality of about 19%. Again, I'm a naturopath. I did not come to medicine thinking that I would put everybody on hormone replacement therapy. I, for a long time, just used herbs to manage symptoms associated with menopause, maybe a little bit of hormone replacement to help with sleep deprivation or with hot flashes. And then I had been trained, get people off of it as soon as possible. And what we see now is that women over 65, there's no reason to come off if it's helpful and supportive. And if you are tolerating it, there are receptors in the brain for testosterone, DHEA, pregnenolone, progesterone, estrogen. these are important to brain function. And there's aesthetic benefits, there's bone benefits, there's basically benefits across the board. So anyone who tolerates it or has high risk of developing dementia, I think it's worth getting on bioidentical hormone replacement and staying on it. So men as well, I tend to use Clomid instead of a lot of testosterone because of the testicular atrophy and some of the clotting risk. But with women, I'd use testosterone. I of course, with liver support, monitoring for breast cancer, of course, but it doesn't increase, it reduces your risk of getting breast cancer. It just will make it grow faster. So we still want to do the monitoring. And then I look at hormone testing every 6 to 12 months, at least every 12 months. And I use blood levels. So this is Lisa's testing, and you can see she was taking oral DHEA, which she absorbs rapidly when we met, but she wasn't on any estrogen. She was taking oral progesterone. She did really well with oral administration. And she also, I want to talk about this parathyroid hormone, but I'm gonna finish the sex hormone conversation first. So like all postmenopausal women, her FSH and LH were elevated. Her DHEA and progesterone looked good because she was orally supplementing, but she wasn't getting any estrogen. So we added estrogen, we added some testosterone topically as well. And her estrogen just never really budged. But I just wanted to share this because there's balance and imbalance. And we didn't get her hormones exactly perfect on the labs, but she did phenomenally well. She started with a MoCA score of 21, and she had very high stress. She was caring for her husband who had severe dementia. Her daughter was helping her, but her husband was a flight risk. He was breaking out of the house. He was sometimes combative and abusive because of his disease process. And it was just extremely stressful for her. And we got her on bioidentical hormone replacement. We supported her adrenals. And the other thing that we did was we suggested that she get a workup for a parathyroid adenoma. And parathyroid adenomas can cause elevated calcium, which can lead to gut issues, mood issues, bone issues, all like basically these diffuse multi-system symptoms. And we identified this for her. She was able to get treatment, and that allowed her with the signal she was getting from her parathyroids was to put more calcium into the blood. And she didn't need that. That was becoming toxic to her. It was hard on her kidneys. And so getting that dealt with, sending her to a specialist. I think she ended up on senecalcet, which is a medication that reduced her parathyroid hormone and the calcium levels. And there was a huge amount of relief in her day-to-day experience. She didn't have as much pain. It was easier for her to get exercise, to get sleep. Her gut stopped bothering her. And so the reason I use her, she's not a perfect hormone case. In fact, it's very imperfect, which is very typical. But the parathyroid hormone and the parathyroid adenoma story is one that I think it gets overlooked often. And if we know to look for it, there's been a handful of patients who I've referred to for parathyroid for that surgery. And it's just life-changing when we can figure out what is going on and get them to the right specialist. So what can you do to protect your brain health? And what can you do to protect the brain health of your patients? Talk about diet, talk about exercise, talk about sleep, talk about stress management, and talk about toxin avoidance. Again, it's not rocket science. It's all the stuff that we already know. And going through the research. Sorry, I don't know why this slide is a little messed up. I just want to remind you of the research that what Dr. Bredesen found was that this approach is better than any drug on the market. And we have been beating our heads as a society, spending way too much money, going down the path of this amyloid hypothesis, when really what we need to do is ask the question, why is amyloid being triggered? And with a functional medicine, complex system science, naturopathic approach, we do a good job of that, and we can see outcomes. And so my goal is that I hope by sharing with you that I have seen it, not just once, but many times with my patients. We have measured it and published it. and that other providers like Dr. Bredesen, Dr. Ornish, other providers have too. I hope that you feel empowered to help your patients go through the common causes of dementia, go through systematically nutrient imbalance, toxic exposure, infections, stressors, structural issues, and signaling, so that they can get the benefit of this approach and protect their brain health at any age, at any stage.
Dr. Heather, I'm so happy you're here. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. We have so many great questions coming in, you guys. I'm so happy. Please keep posting them in the live Q&A section of Zoom. And I'm just gonna get going. I would introduce you, but we kind of already have, Dr. Heather Sandison you're in Southern California, right?
I'm in San Diego, yep.
She's in San Diego, and she is well known for her work in this area of neurological decline, Alzheimer's, dementia. It doesn't matter. She just launched her book, Reversing Alzheimer's, this year, sometime 6 months ago, probably not even.
Yeah,
and instant bestseller. She's so valuable, and we're so happy to have her here today. So I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm just going to get to the questions. We got this question again and again and again. You didn't name the lab you used for that infectious workup. Can you list the name of the test? I know DHA carries it and you can order it through us.
So I use the Cyrex Array 12 for that infectious workup. One of the things that is really helpful about the functional medicine labs, as many of you probably well know, is that there's really clear pricing at the outset. So if someone wants to pay cash, versus if I try to go through LabCorp and I were to run that many immunoglobulin tests, I wouldn't know if my patient was going to be charged thousands of dollars 9 months from now or hundreds of dollars. It's just a lot harder to get that covered by insurance, and it's a lot less predictable. So when I can tell patients, okay, it's $400 for this or $500 for this, then it's predictable and there's not a surprise bill in the mail later on.
Yeah, we love that. And the Cyrex Array 12 is a really popular panel that we carry at DHA. So thanks for naming that. Which one of the organic acid tests did you use?
So I used to use Great Plains. There's a kind of abbreviated organic acid test on the Dutch panel, which I'll run depending on the patient, or Real Time is now running organic acid tests. And then in the Nutri-Eval, I often will run a Nutri-Eval, and that also has an organic acid and a test on it as well. So it just depends on the patient and what else we're looking for. So if we're really hormone focused, then we're probably running a Dutch test. If we're more concerned about nutrients and I'm running a Nutri-Eval anyways, I'll use that. And then in the real-time bundles, now an O test comes with the environmental pollutant and the glyphosate panel. So often we'll end up getting one of those because it's essentially free.
Yeah, I love that. It sounds like organic acid test is in pretty much everything these days. And they're so important. So I know a lot of our providers are ordering that one. So thanks for answering that. Okay, you just touched on hormones briefly. Do you see benefits to begin in perimenopause, even without cognitive decline, when it comes to hormone therapy?
Yeah, so I shared that my perspective on hormone therapy has really changed a lot over the years. Again, I started out as someone who was like, oh, let's just go the natural route. Unless somebody's having severe symptoms, I wouldn't recommend hormone therapy. Now, especially if someone has cognitive risk, bone risk, even cancer risk, not BRCA positive, right? Cancer risk, but there seems to have been clusters of cancer in their family. What we see from the literature is that hormone therapy is reducing all-cause mortality. And so I now am in the camp that believes that I think that, relatively liberally recommending and supporting patients in using hormone therapy as long as they tolerate it. Some women gives them migraines, they can't tolerate it. For other women, if they don't have any symptoms, they don't have any risk, if they don't have dementia risk, they don't have osteoporosis risk, they don't have cancer risk, then maybe it's not worth it. It's another pharmaceutical to fill and another thing to take, and it comes in plastic. Like maybe we just skip the waste. But for many, many, many women, it can be very helpful with sleep and mood and weight gain and all kinds of changes that aren't necessarily hot flashes, vaginal dryness, and like the typical, like menopausal climacteric states of menopause.
Great answer. Are there any studies on the ketogenic diet effect for Parkinson's?
That's a great question. I'm not a Parkinson's expert. I've, of course, seen Parkinson's patients in my clinic and supported them. What we see is that toxins more often than not play a role in Parkinson's. And so my priority is to look at toxins immediately, as quickly as possible, get those down as fast as possible. And a ketogenic diet is a detox diet. So Greg Eckel, who's a colleague of mine, a naturopathic colleague of mine. He is a Parkinson's expert. He's in Utah. And then there's another gentleman named Ken Charlin. He's an MD neurologist and he's in Missouri. And he also does a great job with Parkinson's, as has run Parkinson's summits, I think written a Parkinson's book, as has Greg Eckel. And I would defer to them on exactly the right diet for Parkinson's. But I support patients with Parkinson's getting on a ketogenic diet. With ALS, so in the spectrum of neurodegenerative diseases, my understanding is that the majority of the keto research says, yes, this halts the neurodegenerative process, regardless of whether it's Parkinsonian or it's our Alzheimer's or one of the other types of dementia, if it's posterior cortical atrophy or if it's Lewy body. That the ketogenic diet, you basically get more resource because you're getting more ATP per unit essentially. So you're getting more energy, which is what the brain needs to heal. And then additionally, what there's a recent preprint that shows that ketone esters, that they help to clear amyloid. So specifically for Alzheimer's, I think that this is a really important piece of the puzzle for Parkinson's. I'm not sure that it's quite as direct, but generally you're getting more resource. The other thing is ALS. I just want to mention this because with ALS, what you have is an overfiring of the nervous system. It's basically it's like supercharged and you deplete the system really, really quickly with that. And so that's part of the pathophysiology in ALS. And so you don't want to restrict carbohydrates. What you can do is add ketones, but you wouldn't metabolically get into ketosis. So you wouldn't want to restrict carbohydrates in the case of ALS because what you need is just more fuel because it's burning through. The patient with ALS is burning through that fuel so quickly.
Yeah, so it sounds like
a disservice to restrict carbohydrates. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Individualization is key. I think it's key. And if a provider is wanting to learn more about these types of populations and support these populations more, can you point them in any direction? We're getting these questions coming in and, you're naming other experts in the field. And I'm wondering how you guys got to where you are right now.
Yeah, so the RECODE 2.0 training that Dr. Bredesen does is what I would highly recommend. He has Dr. Neil Nathan and Chris Shade, and I feel super grateful to have contributed. There are a bunch of people who have decades of experience, way more than me, but who all have contributed to that training in addition to Dr. Bredesen. So that's who I would point you in that direction for really understanding this perspective. And I think it's a 40-hour program. So you get to dive really deep with experts in like Neil Nathan in mold, with Chris Shade in heavy metals, and with Anne Hathaway, I think goes into the hormones. So you get this deep degree of expertise in the different facets of how this applies to the neurological system and neurodegenerative diseases.
Wow, that's great. You said the word RECODE a couple times in your presentation, and I know Dr. Bredesen's training includes a bunch of functional lab tests that you include in your presentation, along with blood chemistry. So can you kind of briefly, or maybe more comprehensively, cover the RECODE panel and what it, you showed a couple shots on the hormone panel. Can you just give us like a brief, kind of play-by-play how-to on the RECODE panel and how you guys are you using it on every patient? Are you only using it on some?
So my philosophy, right, is that all complex chronic disease is created by imbalance. There's some sort of homeodynamic balance that we typically have day to day, right? Our body isn't the same. Even a healthy system is not the same at 8 a.m. as it is at 8 p.m., right? So we have these rhythms in our body. So it's not static. It's not homeostasis. It's homeodynamic. But it can still fall out of rhythm and out of balance. And it's that imbalance that creates dysfunctional cells, whether they're in the brain and it's causing neurodegeneration, or it's in the uterus and causing fibroids, or it's in the joints and causing arthritis, right? Like we get dysfunction when we have imbalance. And so the goal is to uncover where is the imbalance coming from. And in that, get patients the information that drives the decision-making on a treatment plan. And so what I see primarily, all of my new patients at this point are dementia, not 100%, but for the most part, I see mold patients, and then I see friends and family members of people who I've been seeing for a long time. But for the most part, I think that it makes a lot of sense for patients to invest in all of the labs up front, for us to have baseline data. Now, I'm a data person. I like having that data, where somebody else might get overwhelmed. I'm like, if I don't have all of this, I don't know what to prioritize, because if I didn't run mold toxins, then what if I don't find them? What if I miss them? And then I want to say 24 hours, but I'm trying to say like 6 months down the road, we are wondering, why aren't we making progress? And then we go back and test the mold, and now I see it, and I wish I had done it 6 months earlier, right? I had that. I think when I used to prioritize for people, their financial resources, when I projected my own insecurity about money onto them, then I wasn't giving them the best health advice, right? So I've really changed my tune about that. And also, especially after understanding the senior living industry and how expensive caregiving is, how not just financially expensive, but how time consuming and draining it is. When you're talking to somebody with neurodegeneration, the thought of spending $5,000 on labs, it's like, or I'm going to spend $8,000 a month on senior living. So if I can spend $5,000 now and have a better life, and I can delay needing senior living, I can delay the need for caregiving, I don't have to deal with having a caregiver in my house, or maybe I can keep my driver's license. That is not a crazy amount of money for a lot of people. That is a total no-brainer investment for them. So I'm not even answering your question, which is like, well, what labs do you run, right? So we run a full female panel or male panel, right? Which is call it like what a traditional conventional doctor would do, but on steroids, right? So it's your CBC, CMP, your thyroid, but it's all 8 thyroid markers, not 2. It's vitamin D, it's homocysteine, it's fasting insulin. It's, of course, a hemoglobin A1C. It's LPPLA2. It's your fractionated lipids in your cholesterol panel. It's cystatin C and GGT. So looking at that comprehensive panel, that's one thing that we do, right? And then in addition, we're running mycotoxins. We're running heavy metals. We are running environmental pollutant panels. We're also going to run the Cyrex Array 12 that we discussed, right? Because we're looking at those different categories. Okay, so where is the imbalance? It can be in nutrients. So we want to understand, what's the A1C doing? What's cholesterol doing? Where is B12? Where's folate? So Nutri-Eval, I usually run a Nutri-Eval or some sort of nutrient test. Plus, we're looking at the typical ones you would run in, through LabCorp or Cleveland Heart Labs or GHA, of course. And then so we're looking at toxins and those 3 flavors. And do you want me to just basically say the names of the labs? So I'm running real-time mycotoxins, real-time environmental pollutants, and glyphosate, and then I run metals through Quicksilver. And then for nutrients, I'm running a Nutri-Eval and then everything that would be on that full male or female panel. And then I always run a stool test, and I tend to run a GI maps. I know that there's some people like that one, some people don't. I get my patient, it matches my patient's experience for the most part. I get good results, and I'm so used to looking at it. I know what's normal and what's not. Like, it's very sensitive for H. pylori, not very sensitive for Candida. But then I can triangulate with the Nutri-Eval and the oat and other things to say, okay, well, what makes sense? Is this person digesting and absorbing? That's what I'm wondering when I look at that Nutri-Eval and the GI map together. And then also I'll have a Cyrex panel. So is Candida showing up on all 3, or is Candida showing up on 2 of the 3? What are their symptoms? And then I can put all of those pieces together and say, okay, how do I prioritize treating Candida in this particular patient? And hopefully that makes sense to everyone. Other testing that we do more recently, the p-tau 217 has been available through LabCorp. This is not covered by insurance, but it's a relatively good directionality marker. So kind of like imaging, MoCA, p-tau 217, they're not in that category of what's causing the disease process, but they're a yardstick for us to say, is this person getting better or worse? So a MoCA is the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. This is a cognitive test, and this is where the rubber meets the road, right? If somebody is doing better, it should mean that day to day their cognition is improving. If someone's doing worse, it should mean that, okay, they're going in the direction of needing more and more help. So that is like the ultimate, right? If we can get that going in the right direction, we are doing our job, we are successful. So then the p-tau 217, the way that Dr. Bredesen has explained it to me is if you take a neuron, it has its arms, like the dendrites, right? And that is held in place there's like structural components of our nerves that hold them in place. And when you start and that's tau, and it's almost like a nut with a bolt on it. Now, when you start picking up phosphorylated tau or p-tau, and 217 is the marker that seems to be most specific to this, it's almost like those bolts have come off and they're in the blood. And so you no longer have that structural integrity in the neurons themselves. And that tells us there's structural degeneration, neurodegeneration. And the higher that number gets, it is associated with, basically the way that this was validated was with amyloid PET scans. So looking at imaging and I think cerebrospinal fluid to say, yes, amyloid is present and this looks like an Alzheimer's case. p-tau has been correlated with that. And although we wouldn't choose p-tau over the imaging, for some patients, right, if they can't get an MRI or something, then p-tau is a marker that we're using more and more to track that change over time. Is this person getting better or worse? So then going back to the causal level piece, I'm thinking through visually my list of labs that we recommend for people. On the causal level side, looking at cortisol, high cortisol is toxic to the hippocampus over time. So we run a Dutch test or we'll do an adrenal stress index. Those are two ways to look at that. A 4-point cortisol is usually a salivary one. Excuse me if I sneeze. And then I think that's a sleep study. So we refer out for an at-home sleep study through WatchPat, so they can do it at home. That's a really important component. I think that's the majority of the testing.
Yeah, that was a great comprehensive list. Thanks. So you guys, if you stay all the way to the end, you're going to get the link to my survey. I'm just reminding you, we really want you guys' feedback so that we can make every webinar better than the last. And we put all of the blood chemistry Dr. Sandison is running on her patients in one panel. It's special. We don't offer it to providers normally, but if you request, we can add that to your portal. And because you registered for the event, we are running a special on that panel too. That's going to save you $150. More is going to come to your inbox tomorrow, but please, please, please stay to the end. Give us some feedback. And Heather, thanks so much for being with us. I'm going to ask you a couple questions about ApoE4 because we're getting a bunch there. So I'm going to start with this one. With 2 ApoE4, metabolizing fat is difficult as cholesterol cannot be moved into and out of cells properly. This usually results in low TGs, high total cholesterol, high LDL, normal HDL. In that case, do you still recommend a keto diet or any other suggestions?
Yeah,
Leslie, thank you for this question. Great question.
Yeah, and then somebody else was asking about like just what is ApoE and how do you interpret the result? So maybe I'll start there if that's okay.
Perfect. Yeah.
So ApoE, you get one from mom, one from dad. So everybody has two copies of ApoE. They can be a 2, a 3, or a 4. So stay with me here. It's 2, 3, or 4. Those are the options. And you get one from mom and one from dad. So you could, very, very, very rare, I've never seen one. You could be a 2-2. If you were, you would be protected against heart disease and dementia. 2-2 is like the ultimate, but nobody has that. 3 is the most common. So you can be a 3-3. This is like 70% of people. This is what most people are. And then you could also have 4. So you would get one from mom. I'm not blaming either of your parents, but you could get one from mom or one from dad, and you could be a 3-4. Or you could get one from mom and one from dad, and you could be a 4-4. So what does that mean? The general population, taking everybody, the 2s, the 3s, the 4s, everybody, has a 13% risk of developing Alzheimer's in their lifetime, of getting a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. When you have one copy of ApoE4, you go to a 30% risk of being diagnosed with Alzheimer's in your lifetime. When you get an ApoE44, you have a much greater than 50% risk of being diagnosed with Alzheimer's in your lifetime. And there was a Nature paper that came out this year that suggested that you basically were guaranteed to get Alzheimer's if you lived over 65. Like, this was crazy. And I think overreaching because they weren't talking about the modifiable risk factors and how many we have. So then what happens with the cardiovascular, which is part of what you're pointing to? So ApoE4 changes how we metabolize fats. So what happens is that you end up with these elevated cholesterol levels. And the question, and the Lancet Commission report that came out this year on Alzheimer's, elevated LDL is one of the modifiable risk factors. So we want to keep that down, regardless of our ApoE status. We want to keep that down if we're trying to prevent dementia. So with ApoE4 or 3/4, when we are talking about the ketogenic diet, what my clinical experience has been is that people who are ApoE4 positive or 3/4 positive, who have memory loss, who have cognitive decline, respond well to the ketogenic diet. They improve their cognition. That this works for an ApoE 3/4 4/4 positive population. Now, so Gundry and Bredesen are fans of keeping out the coconut oil because it's saturated fat that people tend with ApoE4 positive status, and particularly the 4/4s. So saturated fats, which would be like grain-fed animals, right? Fried foods. You're going to be highly sensitive to those kinds of things. Now, when you're talking about olive oil and avocados, probably not so much. Coconut oil is this one where there's this kind of theoretical risk. It's a saturated fat, but it's a medium chain triglyceride. And so when you talk to some experts, including Mary Newport, she says, don't worry about it. If you're ApoE4 positive, keep an eye on your lipids, but you probably don't need to worry about this. Now, when you get into ketosis and you sustain ketosis, you actually drop your total cholesterol levels because you're burning fat for fuel. So yeah, at 12 weeks, it's going up, and typically you'll see that it's higher. But once you're sustaining ketosis, that comes down. Now, if you're not going to sustain ketosis, because I don't really recommend that anybody does, then you want to keep an eye on these lipids. I, right now, am a fan of Zetia, and what you can do is look at sterols. So do you guys run sterols?
Can you run that through LabCorp, or is that a functional third party?
We run it through Boston
Heart.
And Boston Heart usually.
Oh yeah, you can. Yep, we offer any Boston Heart labs.
Okay,
yeah,
great,
sterols.
perfect.
Cool.
So the sterols will tell you if you're a hyperabsorber or a hyperproducer, or if you're both, or if you're neither. And if you happen to be a hyperabsorber, there's a medication called Zetia, Zetia. That's the brand name of it, and it's new-ish. It's an alternative to a statin, as is like Repatha and some of these other injectables that can help to reduce cholesterol without using a statin. So if you're ApoE4 positive and you're getting a ton of benefit from a ketogenic diet cognitively, but you're increasing your heart risk, so because with ApoE4 you increase cardiovascular risk as well as dementia risk. And so when you have that, it's like, I don't want to give you heart disease, even though your cognition is improving. And so potentially using these medications along with something like bergamot, amla, there's a bunch of herbs. We could go on and on about berberines. Berberines will affect gut microbiome, so I don't always use that. But bergamot plus amla is something that I've seen help. And most of the research has been done. So if you talk to the cardiologist, they usually want to do Zetia plus a statin. But I've been able to, in my patients on a ketogenic diet with ApoE4 positive labs, say, let's do Zetia plus high fiber plus the bergamot plus amla, and we can keep everything at a zone where cardiology's happy, we're not suppressing total cholesterol below 200 every time, but everybody feels like, okay, the risk is mitigated here.
Okay, so it's safe. So it's safe to be on a ketogenic diet as long as it's long-term, as you said, because you'll start burning fat no matter which type of pairing of the ApoE4. Work
with your provider and watch the labs. Look and see what happens. But my experience has been that patients who are ApoE 3/4 positive and 4/4 positive respond well to a ketogenic diet. Mm-hmm. So it's important, and I think worth the time and effort that goes into figuring out how to make a ketogenic diet safe for you.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Okay, thanks, Dr. Heather. Let's see, what's the implication on brain health and seizure activity from a TBI? How is that impacting Alzheimer's dementia?
Say that one more time. The impact of
what's the implication on Alzheimer's dementia / brain health and seizure activity from a TBI, traumatic brain injury? So
I guess somebody had a TBI and now has seizures, And then they're concerned about, because the seizures, I think, is what's throwing me off. So TBI.
I think their question, Dandelion Healing Tribe, if you want to throw it in the chat, what your any clarification, I think they're asking if TBI increases risk for Alzheimer, dementia,
100%.
brain health and seizure activity. So maybe that's not already there, but the TBI is there.
Yeah, so TBIs, traumatic brain injuries, absolutely. CTE, the chronic traumatic encephalopathy, that is like the football player, very classic. But traumatic brain injuries in general, as a child, playing football, not playing football, riding horses, multiple car accidents, especially multiple traumatic brain injuries, increase the risk of dementia over time. And we see this really clearly on imaging. People with TBIs, there's this coup counter coup. So it's like the back right and the front left, where you see less perfusion. Wherever they hit their head, you can see that there's a change in perfusion. And it can be from a TBI a week ago, or a TBI a year ago, or a TBI 12 years ago, or decades ago, right? So this lasts. This is something that persists. And so, yes, 100% TBIs are something you want to avoid. Again, they're on the Lancet Commission report of modifiable behaviors or risk factors when it comes to dementia. And there is inflammation. So whenever you trigger inflammation, or you're triggering microglial activation, right? So the immune system has a way to, get rid of things and respond. And just like if you got a cut on your hand, you would want your immune system to do what it needs to do to create inflammation to resolve it. So when you hit your head, you want that inflammation. You want blood flow. You want everything coming to support and heal that part of the brain. But when it creates long-term inflammation and long-term microglial activation, your brain is potentially trying to protect the rest of your brain, right? It's trying to wall off that area. It's creating inflammation. It's creating this downstream activation that puts you at risk of developing dementia. Absolutely. So what can you do about it? One, address any TBIs that are recent as fast as possible. And we do high dose omegas, methyl B12, phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylserine, IV NAD, as much as you can to activate that area and resolve the healing process. Give that part of the brain as much support as possible. And then meditation, blue light blocking glasses, like get the toxins out, get the nutrients up, everything that we've been discussing.
Thanks, Heather. I love that. How high does serum estradiol need to be for cognitive protection? You talked a little bit about hormones. This is a question from Christy. Christy, thank you.
Yeah, great question. So I aim for 50 to 75 on a serum, on blood levels of estradiol. But some women are going to get migraines at that level, and some people won't feel anything and it won't manage their symptoms, and other people will feel like that's too much. So I really let the patient tell me. I use the labs to say, are we radically high or radically low? And if we're there, then I adjust. And if not, then I'm looking for their feedback and their comfort. And like, is this resolving the issue for you? So that's the primary thing for me. And what I understand from the May study that was published that I mentioned in the talk is that those medium to low doses are where you want to be. So like a Wiley protocol where you keep women cycling, that is not how I do things. And I think that when that was included in the data, it looked like those high doses of estrogen stopped being protective. It was most protective when it was on low to medium doses.
Mm-hmm. Could you repeat who you refer to for sleep studies? This is a question from Deborah.
A great question. So WatchPat, like WatchPat, PAT. WatchPat is who, and I'll put that in there too. They are who we use. They were bought. So that company was acquired and now they do it slightly differently. But if you look up WatchPat, we refer now to a local place and then they run it all through Medicare. And that has worked for us. To be totally honest, I don't do a lot of that back end stuff. My staff does, but they've figured out how to track down WatchPat and make sure we're referring to a sleep center that then uses them. And then they connect with the patient. And it's basically we refer out so that sleep medicine can be involved, and all of that can be run through Medicare.
Thank you. Greta is saying it's interesting that the paper from Dr. Ornish showed similar improvements with a high complex carb, low fat vegan diet. Have you ever tried this approach in some patients?
Yeah, I think that this is a really great question, and I have it too. It's like I think that what I've taken away from the Ornish paper and this approach, and like the Sherazais are a couple, they're a married couple in California who are neurologists who also have a vegetarian approach. And my takeaway is there's more than one right way to do this, right? So if you have somebody who is adamant they are not going into ketosis, they just can't give up their carbs, then you could point them in the direction of a vegan diet and still expect to get benefit. And in our trial, not everybody who got better went all the way into ketosis. So you don't have to achieve ketosis in order to improve. And I don't want anybody in ketosis forever, right? 3 to 6 months. And then I recommend going back and forth with a plant-based vegan diet, whole foods, non-processed, organic, always. Now, I think that there's multiple ways to do this. I do have concerns about anybody being on a vegan diet forever, long term. I think that you can run into nutrient deficiencies. And same thing with a keto diet long term. I think what you want is metabolic flexibility, and that if we were to look at them head to head, what we would see is that it works. Each of them work for some people. And ultimately, what you want to do is go back and forth. You want metabolic flexibility. You want variety in your diet. You want it to change with the seasons. You like the consistent thing about ancestral diets is inconsistency. And so I think that what we want to do is approximate that, because that's how our ancestors, it's like our bodies have evolved to process foods that are available naturally in the environment, that are not processed, that are not always available, that there's not always carbohydrates available. There's not always meat available. There's not always eggs available. So that variety, I think, is what's most important. But the Ornish paper showed us there's more than one way to do this and get good outcomes. And so I think that that's the only other piece I want to say here is I think you can do it with the vegan diet. I have not seen anything as profound for cognitive function as getting into ketosis. And so I think if you skip that part, my confidence that you will see really dramatic improvement goes down.
Oof, that's powerful, you guys. Drop in the chat if you thought that was powerful too. Here's a question from Karen. Karen is asking, are there any over-the-counter medications that are causing or leading to dementia or cognitive decline, Alzheimer's later in life?
Yeah, great question. So antihistamine, so like your Benadryl, Claritin, like diphenhydramine, and even Tylenol PM, right, has antihistamine. It has diphenhydramine in it often. Those also have an anticholinergic effect. So it's mostly antihistamine, but they're also slightly anticholinergic. And if you probably have heard of some of the dementia medications help with acetylcholine. So if you're reducing acetylcholine, when we know that acetylcholine is the most abundant neurotransmitter in the brain and necessary for memory, then there is some risk with that. You don't want to be on antihistamines long term. Now, what the medications that are most associated with cognitive decline and dementia are benzodiazepines and narcotics, right? So those really change memory, and especially over time.
Awesome. Thank you. Julie's asking about normal pressure hydrocephalus. My mom is in trouble with this, and a shunt will not benefit her. Symptoms are similar to dementia and Parkinson's. Do you have anything to say there?
Yeah, so NPH, normal pressure hydrocephalus, this is something that everyone who has, typically it's the combination of three things. And in medical school, we remembered it as wet, wobbly, and weird. So there's dementia. There's like when you see someone walk down a hall and they have normal pressure hydrocephalus, they're like trying to hang on to the wall. They're wobbly. They're very unstable on their feet. And then wet is incontinent. So wet, wobbly, weird. And most NPH patients have all three. Not all of them, but most of them. And then on imaging, what you see is this symmetrical bilateral growth of the ventricles. So it's the negative space. It's where the cerebral spinal fluid is. It basically gets bigger and bigger, and the brain itself is shrinking because there's too much, it's normal pressure hydrocephalus, but there's too much cerebral spinal fluid. So that's why a shunt can sometimes be a way to approach this, where they basically put in, this is not a nothing burger surgery. This is like you're basically tapping cerebral spinal fluid to keep the pressure lower so that the brain has more space to has more space in the skull to take up space and isn't being cramped by the fluid. So an MRI, it doesn't have to be anything fancy. And when you do imaging for someone with cognitive decline, that should be done by default. Basically, they should comment on the size of the ventricles, that they are symmetrical or asymmetrical. Some of them, not all imaging centers say this, not all radiologists will say this, but it should say that NPH is ruled out or something to that degree. And you can always go back and ask the neurologist or the radiologist, does this look like NPH? Is it possible this is NPH? This is something we really want to rule out, because the thing with NPH is, and I sort of got excited when you said that your mom had it, because this is a treatable form of dementia. And so when you there aren't many of those, right? Where there's okay, we can go get this shunt put in and she might be way better 3 days later. It's a procedure and you have to have anesthesia, which again is hard on the brain and can be associated with dementia. But this is something where there is something that conventional medicine can do to help that patient. Now, those shunts work about 30% of the time. So sometimes there's crossover, people with alcoholism can have kind of what looks like NPH. They can be wobbly, they can be incontinent, they can have dementia, and it's more of a Wernicke-Korsakoff kind of picture, or B vitamin deficiency, kind of these post, even when people have stopped drinking, you can see this. And it's if there's a question of what's causing it, if it's actual NPH or if it's something else, it's gosh, do we really want to put somebody through this shunting process and that procedure if there's only a 30% chance that they're going to improve, even if what they do have is NPH? So thanks, Julie, for adding that color to it. She is not a candidate for the shunt and wouldn't benefit. That's not uncommon. If you have an NPH diagnosis, it's really important to go through that process to see if you are a candidate for that procedure. Because before I had gone to school, I had a client who had normal pressure hydrocephalus, and it was found, and he put the shunt in, and it was like magic. It has the potential to be that. If you're not a candidate, you're not a candidate, which is really heartbreaking and really, really hard. I'm so sorry.
Thanks, Dr. Sandison. So we have one more live question left. You guys, please stay to the very end after this question, because I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to pop up the QR code that's going to take you to the end of the webinar survey. We really, really, really want your feedback. Let us know how Heather did. Let us know what you think. We want the next one to be even better than this one. I don't know how it could possibly be better, because Dr. Heather Sandison is so amazing, but please just stay till the end. And then we have a really special code for you guys. We put together over 40 markers for that RECODE panel. So we have the full cholesterol markers, the over 8 thyroid panels. We have A1C, we have C-reactive protein, we have inflammatory markers, we have everything. So that is coming to you. But next, last question, could you address protocols for dealing with spike proteins from COVID vax? Do you see success in using any of the spike protein specific protocols? Thank you, Shirley.
Yeah, so what we see, just generally with COVID, I see that people who get COVID do worse cognitively. I think everybody sees that, but particularly people with dementia, that tends to be a hit for them. And then getting the vaccines seems to also potentially, they decline cognitively after that, and it takes a while to recover. So our approach is I use the arteriosil, that product, and then the Biochemical, I don't even know how to say that, but the serrapeptidase nattokinase,
So essentially what we're trying to do is protect the arterial wall, that endothelial layer, and then also to help break up the cytokines that can cause that hypercoagulability. So the approach is to reduce that coagulation potential that can lead to the mini strokes, essentially, or a lack of perfusion in the brain that can then be associated with the cognitive decline. So what we're trying to get is maximum perfusion to the brain, as much as possible, and then reducing the risk of the mechanism by which COVID seems to be doing that, and the vaccines seem to be doing that, which is nattokinase, lumbar kinase, break up the cytokines and protect their arterial wall.
Thanks, Dr. Sandison. It was so great to have you today. You guys, I'm about to share my screen, but please give us some thanks in the chat for Dr. Heather.
Thank you. Thank you for making this accessible and available, and for just supporting the work that I do and the way that you do. I'm so grateful.
Yeah, absolutely. We couldn't be more honored to. Thank you so much. I'm going to cry, you guys. We got to get Heather out of here.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you for having me. Be well.
Thank you guys.